It's our honor to welcome to the stage Representative Hakeem Jeffries. Representative Jeffries, welcome to AXIOS.
Hey, great to be here.
So less than 12 hours ago, I saw you live on CNN.
That's right.
And less than 14 hours ago, you were being held hostage on MSNBC.
That's right.
So you were on a breaking news block on Mueller.
I feel liberated right now.
Walking away from the breaking news about Mueller, do you feel like that news is going to define the next 2 years?
Well, I think what's going to define the next few years is our For the People agenda. We were very clear in the few months leading up to the midterm elections that were we given the opportunity to govern, we were going to focus on three things: lowering health care costs, increase pay for everyday Americans, do a real infrastructure plan, and cleaning up corruption in Washington, D.C. And so that's our forward-looking, affirmative, kitchen table, pocketbook issue-oriented agenda. And that's where we want to keep the focus on. At the same time, you know, we have a responsibility to carry out our oversight functions in a responsible manner.
So you won the House leadership race, and those are the most vicious races there are to be House Democratic chair. You called it, perhaps with a wink, you called it a friendly contest of ideas.
Well, that's correct. I mean, member-on-member races are always complicated and difficult because there's relationships, you know, on all sides throughout the caucus, and people have to choose one or the other. But, you know, I have tremendous respect for Barbara Lee, and she's a great visionary member of the House Democratic Caucus, and, you know, her voice, which is a strong one, will continue to be heard in a powerful way.
So just as you came on stage, you and I were talking about your work on the First Step Act, the historic criminal justice bill. What else do you think can be done between House Democrats and the president?
Well, one of the things that we want to work on in the context of driving down health care costs is reducing the high price of life-saving prescription drugs.
Which he said he's for.
So he came to the State of the Union, indicated that that's something that he wanted to work on, that's important. Our starting point is that we believe the federal government through Medicare should be given the ability to use its bulk price purchasing power to negotiate lower drug prices on behalf of the American people. That's what happens in industry. That's what the federal government should be able to do on behalf of the American people to balance the scales of the negotiation. He didn't come up to that line, but there's at least a baseline for us to have a discussion since he's acknowledged that we have to do something about prescription drug prices.
And so what would you say is the outlook for pulling off something real on that the president will sign over the next 2 years?
Well, from our standpoint, it's more likely than not, but because it seems to us that the president needs something affirmative to communicate to the American people he's gotten done when the only meaningful piece of legislation from his vantage point is what we would refer to as a GOP tax scam, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1%. We said from the beginning this was a fraud as it relates to working families, middle-class folks, and those who aspire to be part of the middle class. And now we're seeing millions of Americans are being shortchanged in terms of the refunds that they expected to receive and are receiving much less.
Okay, so more likely than not, something real signed on lowering the cost of prescription drugs. That's news for those of you tweeting along at hashtag AXIOS360. What about the same thing about something real on infrastructure?
I think that's the other opportunity to try to get something done. We have a $1 trillion infrastructure plan that we think would help fix our crumbling bridges, roads, tunnels, mass transportation system, ports, airports, schools, as well as public housing developments that are crumbling all across the country. We also think it would create 16 million good-paying jobs over a 5-year period of time. And it's one of the central parts of our For the People agenda. Again, the president mentioned it during the State of the Union address. He only spent about 9 seconds on it, but, you know, we'll take that. Better than nothing. In his acknowledgement that it's something that should happen. And if we can do something bipartisan on criminal justice reform, seems to me we should be able to do something on health care and protecting people with pre-existing conditions. That was the defining issue of the 2018 midterm elections, and then we should be able to do something about infrastructure.
While you were working on the First Step Act, you developed quite a sincere relationship with Jared Kushner. Is What was that like, and are you hopeful that could continue with another issue?
Well, certainly, and around the First Step Act, one, I always want to shout out my partner, Doug Collins, who was a driving force behind that legislation, did a tremendous job. And a lot of people were perplexed by the fact that we were able to form this partnership initially between Doug and myself, and he's a conservative Republican from rural Georgia, and I'm a progressive Democrat from what often has been referred to as the People's Republic of Brooklyn. And Doug and I decided this was something that we needed to work on, but we, of course, needed a White House partner. And it became clear over time that Jared Kushner was sincerely, authentically committed to trying to get something done, in large measure, as he would talk about, because of his own personal experience with incarceration in the context of his dad, who he would visit on a weekly basis. And he played a meaningful role. And hopefully, now that there's an open line of communication between not just Kushner and myself, but Kushner and several members who are important in the House Democratic Caucus, like Cedric Richmond, who's the former chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, who worked closely on this issue, that we can build upon it.
Joe Scarborough, Morning Joe, I think you will agree, has not lately been a big booster and backer of President Trump. He said this morning, Joe Scarborough said, with the Green New Deal, House Democrats have given President Trump his 2020 closing argument, making something unthinkable possible, and that is the president's being reelected. He says of House Democrats, they've got to play smarter. What happened?
Well, I think putting aside, the outsized attention that tends to be focused on issues that seem to project conflict, if you think about the journey that we've been on, it began with a 35-day government shutdown, ended with an unconditional surrender from Donald Trump. He tried to flex his muscles as it related to the State of the Union address. Speaker Pelosi's done a tremendous job, made clear we are a separate and co-equal branch of government. We decide whether you get that microphone or not, and you're not going to get it in the midst of a reckless government shutdown. And we just negotiated a bipartisan deal that is a win for the American people. But many people are interpreting it as a loss for Donald Trump from the context of, first, he said that he was going to build a wall from sea to shining sea, and Mexico was going to pay for it. They refused. Then over the last 2 years, Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency. He had a $25 billion wall deal on the table that he walked away from. After 2 years of complete Republican control, got nothing. Then he shut down the government, tried to extract a $5.7 billion ransom note from us because he was holding federal workers and the American people hostage. We refused, anchored in the principle that shutdowns aren't a legitimate negotiating tactic. And now, like we've said, reopen the government, we'll have a mature conversation about border security, and we'll find common ground. That's what we've done. So if you put aside all of the noise about Democrats being in trouble, seems to me we've gotten off to a pretty good start.
Do you worry that the Green New Deal has let Republicans off the mat, that it's given them a target?
Well, I think the Green New Deal is an important addition to what is needed as it relates to a robust discussion about doing something meaningful about climate change. For the last 8 years, Republican control of the House has essentially meant that they've done nothing about climate change. I think Louis Gohmert, who I served with on the Judiciary Committee, and and have enjoyed my time watching him in the Congress, surprised me almost one day when he went on the House floor and he said, I believe in climate change. This is breaking news. I believe in climate change. It's called the winter, spring, summer, and fall. This is their philosophy. Now, the reality is that, as the military has said, climate change is a national security threat to the safety and security of the United States of America.
Okay, so we can agree it's real and it's a problem. Is the way that it's been dealt with, was that a little bit of an own goal for House Dems?
No, because I think that the central way in which it has been dealt with has been that Speaker Pelosi has appointed a select committee on climate change with a lot of thoughtful voices led by Representative Kathy Castor. And that will be the driving entity as to how we decide to approach this issue.
Right. And last one on this, you may have seen Senator Stabenow made news when she said that there's going to be an effort to tighten up, was the phrase that she used, the language to make it more clear what was actually intended. Do you think that will happen on the House side as well?
I mean, that's a question better asked, I think, of some of the sponsors, but I do think...
Would you like to see that happen?
Well, I think it's important. Every legislative product goes through changes and iterations. That was the case as it relates to the First Step Act from beginning to end. What we started with was not where we ended, so I would expect the same thing will happen with the Green New Deal.
So on shutdowns, you used the phrase, I love this phrase, evidence-based legislation. What can you do to prevent future shutdowns? There's Senator Portman and others have talked about ways to do that. Do you see that happening? Do you see any momentum for preventing future shutdowns?
I definitely think there's a lot of momentum for ending the use of the shutdown. It has consistently failed to advance the agenda of whoever is the individual that has provoked the shutdown, or the particular conference that has provoked the shutdown, depending on what you look at over the last 25 or so years. And so it seems that we have to figure out a way legislatively to end this. Now, that will be complicated, and we're not going to rush to do it, and we want to do it in a bipartisan way.
But you would like to see effort along those lines, and you think that there is momentum for that?
I think there's definitely momentum for it, and the notion that you're going to hold hostage hundreds of thousands in this most recent instance, millions of people in other instances, and increasingly the economy, which these shutdowns do billions and billions of dollars worth of damage to the economy. We have to find a way to prevent it.
Last night when you were anchoring that breaking news coverage on MSNBC, you said, clearly Bob Mueller is building a case for collusion. Do you worry that Democrats are setting the bar too high?
I don't think so, because I think we just have to let Bob Mueller be Bob Mueller and do his work. We have a responsibility as a separate and co-equal branch of government to do our work. We don't work for Donald Trump, we work for the American people. And we have a constitutional responsibility to serve as a check and balance on an out-of-control executive branch and allow the Mueller investigation to run its course. In terms of the breaking news, what was interesting about it is increasingly there appears to be a triangular relationship between the Trump campaign, WikiLeaks, and Russian spies as part of an effort to sell out our democracy and artificially, perhaps, place someone at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Bob Mueller is going to have to continue his investigation, and we'll see what is revealed. But what is becoming clear is that we know that the top official of the Trump campaign, in addition to the several others, Paul Manafort, campaign chairman, we know he's a crook. We know he's a liar. It appears he may have been a Russian asset. Whether that was witting or unwitting, I think Bob Mueller is going to figure that out. And then what was his relationship with his longtime friend, Roger Stone, who's also a longtime friend of Donald Trump, and the more than 100 different contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. So he's going to have to unravel all of that, and we're going to let him do his work. We're not going to overreach. We're not going to over-politicize. We're not going to over-investigate, but we will do our constitutional duty.
And you say let Mueller be Mueller, but Axios has reported the quite extensive blueprint that House Democrats have for an investigation into Trump and Russia. It involves multiple committees, likely public hearings, more witnesses. You used the phrase last night, you said that you're going to be building a record for the American people. Tell me what the goal is, or what you intend to have when that process, which could continue into 2020, is over.
Well, I think it's just transparency as it relates to what has or has not happened as it relates to the executive branch. And as I've mentioned before, that's not the Hakeem Jeffries playbook. That's the James Madison playbook. Like, he clearly indicated the legislative branch is supposed to be a rival to the executive, because the founders of this country did not want an out-of-control monarchy. They wanted to rein that in. They decided the constitutional fabric that can enable that to happen is the separate and co-equal branch of government.
So what should this record include?
Well, for instance, as an example, on the Judiciary Committee yesterday, we had a markup for a universal health care bill and, excuse me, universal background check. A lot of universal things floating in the universe right now. Universal background check legislation, which 97% of the American people support. And so a lot of focus has been on what will the House Judiciary Committee, for instance, might do relative to the Mueller investigation. We actually, have spent a significant part of our time trying to solve problems on behalf of the American people. The gun violence epidemic is one of them.
But separately from that, as part of that oversight function, what record do House Democrats intend to build on this question?
Well, I think when we had the acting attorney general who came before us last week. And
by the way, you had quite a moment with him.
Yeah. Who are you?
Tell them real quick, act it out real quick.
But, I think what we were ultimately trying to establish was what is the level of interference that may or may not have taken place connected to the Mueller investigation? And is there some command and control effort to stifle Bob Mueller's independent investigation? Again, it goes back to the notion of let Mueller be Mueller. But for the last 2 years, there's been no oversight done to get any real insight into whether there's interference or not, or whether Mueller is going to be allowed to complete his investigation and then report those findings to the American people.
By the way, the chairman with Matt Whitaker, the punchline to that, when he said, "Who are you?" and Whitaker tried to answer, and the chairman said, "Mr. Whitaker, that was a statement, not a question. I assume you know the difference."
Yeah. Well, I think once I had to get a little Brooklyn on him. But the thing was that, he came and he was so disrespectful and petulant at the outset when he said to Jerry Nadler, "Your 5 minutes is up." And so at that point, he set the tone in terms of how he was going to proceed. We always are going to interact with witnesses in a very respectful way, but he should also respect the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans.
Penultimate question. You're the former whip of the Congressional Black Caucus. What should happen in Virginia?
Well, I think that save the toughest questions for the next to last questions. But I think what I've said is based on the governor's initial acknowledgement that he was in that photo, either in blackface or as a KKK figure, that the right thing to do for the Commonwealth of Virginia would have been for him to resign. And that was the position that I took once it was clear that the Virginia congressional delegation in the House, beyond other figures in the Senate and elsewhere in Virginia, had concluded that that in fact was the case. My view now, given the mess that exists as it relates to both the governor, lieutenant governor, where there's very serious allegations made by very serious people, which demand a very serious investigation and accountability, and then of course the situation with the Attorney General, is that, I'll take my cues from not just the Legislative Black Caucus in Virginia, but my colleagues in the congressional delegation.
So just for people keeping score, you think there should be 2 resignations?
No, I don't. My view.
You think there should be 0 resignation?
My view is that it needs to be sorted out. And I'm going to defer to the representatives of the Commonwealth of Virginia to work through sorting it out. I don't want to get out ahead of them, just like I would expect that they wouldn't get out ahead of myself or members of the New York delegation were we to face a similar political crisis.
You talk about what we can learn from Brooklyn hip-hop. And you've talked about Jay-Z going from being a Brooklyn rapper to being a near billionaire. You've talked about what we can learn, the impact on your life of Biggie Smalls. Tell us what we can learn from Jay-Z and Biggie Smalls.
Well, Biggie Smalls, one of the things that he said is, I went from negative to positive, and it's all good. In fact, quoted those lyrics on the House floor during the 20th anniversary of his passing. It was interesting because I then ran into, a few weeks ago, one of my constituents on Fulton Street, near to where Biggie Smalls grew up and came into fame. And he said, "Aren't you the congressman that shouted out Biggie Smalls on the House floor 2 years ago?" I said, "Yeah, that was me." He said, "And now I hear that you're the #5 Democrat in the House of Representatives?" I said, "Yeah, kind of worked out. And he said, how did that happen?
Who are you?
All right. And, you know, I could respond the only way that I could respond by quoting the Biggie Smalls lyric, which is, you never thought that hip-hop would take it this far. And so I think that Biggie Smalls, Jay-Z, in many ways, you know, captures sort of the aspirational aspect of the American dream, American exceptionalism, that it doesn't just apply in wealthy suburbs, it applies in the inner city.
I'd like to thank the AXIOS events team, my other AXIOS colleagues for their constant miracles. Thank C-SPAN for your live coverage. Thank the Bank of America for making these conversations possible. Thank all of you for starting Valentine's Day with us. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Drop the mic.
All right.
Thank you so much.